I'd like to start by thanking Charles and my hosts and sponsors for bringing me here. It's my first time in Detroit and in Michigan, and it's a great pleasure to be in this new place. And as a guest of your state and your city, I felt it was important to listen to my host. And yesterday, I'm sure many of you received this email. It said, "Hospitality Summit 1 day away." And dear Richard, here's a final thought to consider for our Hospitality Summit, which begins tomorrow at 7 p.m. Don't forget, get on that plane in the morning. And anyway, this is what it said. I quote, "For generations we have sought the interconnectedness of great religious traditions through reason, sight, and hearing. The day of a parallel route is coming into view, one that travels intentionally through the senses of touch, smell, and taste, in short, the way of hospitality." So, one of the fundamental principles of hospitality is to, as a guest, listen to your host. I decided to listen to this final thought, which came before I was to deliver my first thoughts here tonight. And I did my best to sort of rewrite, redraft, rejig, as we say in Ireland, my thoughts for tonight. And so I'm going to try and address this question of touch and taste and smell, where possible, which are, according to Aristotle, the primary senses. They're the immediate senses, and the ones that in fact relate most immediately to what is strange in the world and to the ultimate stranger, the divine. So says Aristotle. It's the most universal of the senses, touch. Then taste and smell are also immediate, and then you go to the sight and sound, which are the dominant senses, but they're not as immediate. And indeed, Thomas Aquinas says, if you want to relate to God, you begin with taste. And of course, he was speaking also of the Last Supper and of the Eucharist, because it is in taste that you find the interiority of the Spirit and of the divine. So, I want to try and loosely, at any rate, address these two primary senses, going right back to our reptilian brain, by the way, of touch and taste, which are very often neglected senses when it comes to theology and philosophy, where it's all about seeing God and hearing God, but not very often about touching the stranger, the divine stranger, the human stranger, or indeed the animal stranger. And taste, likewise, is often a neglected theme of theory, even though when one looks at the texts and one looks at the practices of hospitality, both practical hospitality and spiritual hospitality, you find that they're actually very much at the center. And recently I wrote a book called Anatheism, about returning to God after God, and finding God again in the world after the Enlightenment and after many sort of secular atheist critiques of the divine as power and as oppression and domination. Some of those critiques are absolutely necessary. But can you rediscover God in the world after those critiques? This was a philosophical question I was asking. And in the opening of that book, I talk about the hospitality of food and eating as the inaugural act of all great religions. And I take in particular the religions from which I personally hail, that is to say the Abrahamic tradition, and so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But I believe it is, and I tried to address this in another edited book called Hosting the Stranger Between Religions, it is also absolutely primary in Buddhism and in Hinduism, not to mention other religions beyond my competence. So I'm going to talk mainly this evening, insofar as I address the question of hospitality in the religious traditions. I'm going to refer mainly to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But I also, time permitting, would like to say a little bit about some of the Eastern religions, and particularly Hinduism, if time permits. But I want to begin with some stories, and I want to say where I'm speaking from, because when I first went to study philosophy in France with Emmanuel Levinas, a Jewish philosopher, and a Christian Protestant philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, I sat there in the seminar, graduate seminar, and he went around the room and he addressed me. He saw me, I was a guest of the nation, he was my host, and he says, "D'où parlez-vous?" I said, sorry, what does that mean? D'où parlez-vous? Where do you speak from? So he said, this is a primary question if we're going to have a conversation. It's to know where you're speaking from. And I'll tell you where I'm speaking from. And everybody at the table says where they're speaking from. So I'm going to begin by saying a little bit about where I speak from, which is largely the Abrahamic tradition, but more particularly the Christian tradition, and more particularly still, perhaps, it's always a struggle, the Catholic Christian tradition in Ireland. A problematic tradition because there has been a war for 500 years between Protestants and Catholics in and on our island. So the question of hostility in religion is very much to the fore, and then the question becomes, is it possible to have hospitality after hostility, through hostility, in spite of hostility? And of course, one thing I learned from Paul Ricoeur was that the root of hostility and hospitality in all the Indo-European languages is the same. Hostis and hospes can mean originally both guest and enemy. So from the very beginning there has been this ambiguity, so that hospitality is hospitality and vice versa. So you've got to struggle with this question of how do you wrestle, translate, achieve hospitality from hostility. Otherwise hospitality is cheap grace. It's just, well, we all want to be hospitable, don't we? Of course we do. We all want to love each other, don't we? Of course we do. But for it to be a task, a wager, an adventure, a challenge, then it becomes real. And it's a word, I think, that has to be rescued from a certain sentimental piosity, just as the word love does. You know, if I come into this room and I say, who believes in love? Whoops, everybody's hand goes up. But it's a cliche, it's jaded. Love means everything and nothing, and yet it's the most important word in our language. And hospitality is probably a pretty close second, one could argue, and is a version, of course, in practice, of love. So, where do I speak from? Well, let me begin with some stories about hospitality and hostility in Northern Ireland, my island. In 1492, at the beginning of so many divisions in our country, there were two tribes at war, two families at war, the Butlers of Ormond and the Fitzgeralds of Kildare. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, of course, being one of their late ancestors, or late descendants. There was a war between them. They were killing each other. It was a cycle of revenge and resentment and hatred, and it was going on and on. And eventually, the Fitzgibbons cornered the Butlers in Dublin. The Butlers retreated into Dublin Cathedral. They were surrounded. And Lord Fitzgibbons came and he said, or Lord Fitzgerald, I'm sorry, came and said, come out, I will not kill you. And Butler said, no, I don't believe you. You said that before. And when I came out, you killed me, or you killed my father, or my forefather. I'm not coming out. So Lord Fitzgerald said, cut a hole in the door of the cathedral. And so they did. And I will put my arm through. So he took off his armour, the hole was cut in the door, and he extended his bare arm through the hole in the door. Which is still there, by the way, you can go and see it. And it's called to this day in Ireland, chancing your arm. I don't know whether you have the phrase here. To chance your arm. It means to take a wager. Take the risk of the 70s and 80s. It came about in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement. Shortly before that, I had occasion to be in a workshop for paramilitary ex-prisoners in Derry, Londonderry. And during the course of the workshop, it was a conference called Living Beyond Hate. One of the ex-prisoners stood up and explained why he had become a terrorist, a member of the IRA, why he had gone and placed bombs in supermarkets, in public houses, in buses. And he said, the reason I did this was because When I was young, my father was taken out by the bee specialists, was taken to a wood, was beaten to a pulp and left dead. That's when I was 3. When I was 10, my elder brother was taken out, and he was kneecapped and left bleeding to death. Fortunately recovered, but maimed for the rest of his life. When I was 12, my mother, witnessing the loss of her husband and the maiming of her son, had a nervous breakdown and committed suicide. I joined at the age of 16 the IRA, and I decided I had only one aim in life, and that was to bring back honour to the name of my family that had been so traduced. And he said, that's why I did what I did. And that's why I spent 15 years in prison. And I'm saying it now because I'm ashamed of what I did, but it's why I did what I did. And he said, I'm lucky to be alive because when I was in the IRA, one night, people broke into my house. They took me from my bed. They locked my wife and children into a room. And they took me in a car, they blindfolded me, brought me to a barn in the country. They tied me to a chair and they said, we're going to shoot you for what you've done. And I said to my assassin, I said, can I smoke a cigarette before I die? And the assassin waited. And then after a minute said, okay. And he lit a cigarette and he gave me the cigarette. And I had a cigarette in my mouth because the hands were tied. And there I was. I had what? How long does it take to smoke a cigarette? 3 minutes, 5 minutes, depending on how slowly you smoke. This guy smoked really slowly. And as he was smoking, he also told the story of why he had become a killer. And the assassin took the cigarette from his mouth every so often so he could speak and put it back in. And he knew literally he now had 3 minutes to live, 2 minutes to live. And he gave a version, probably a bit more abbreviated than I've just given now, of what he had suffered and what had made him into a killer. A professional of murderous hostility, if you will. And then he finished the cigarette. And he finished the story. And there was silence. And he waited for the gun to go off, which had been placed at the back of his head. And suddenly he no longer felt the gun on the back of his head. And then he waited, and the gun didn't go off. And he waited, and there was no further sound. And after an hour, he finally managed to free himself, turned around, and there was nobody in the barn. He had, for some inexplicable reason, been spared. So we told this story in the workshop, where everybody was saying where they came from, this is where I come from, this is what I did. And at that moment, another man stood up, and he said, I was your assassin. But I decided not to kill you when I heard your story, because I realized as I heard your story that it was my story. And I was killing you for the same reasons that you were killing me. And at that moment, they shook hands. They crossed the floor and they shook hands. And it was a very, very powerful moment. But if that kind of shaking of hands didn't happen on the ground, between the practitioners of hostility, hospitality could never have happened up there. Photographed and telegraphed and telecommunicated throughout the world. So it begins on the ground, and it begins with a handshake. That is to say, touch. And in the case of the exchange of stories, the hospitality of listening and telling, there was also a blindfold. And sometimes, in order to get in touch with the primary senses, we need to block off perhaps the dominant sense, which has been, in Western civilization at any rate, the predominant sense, and throughout Western theology and Western philosophy. and Western civilization. So perhaps it is in getting back to the hospitality of touch and the hospitality of taste that we may rediscover hospitality at that very root from which hostility comes. Because the skin that is exposed in touch is the fragility and exposure and vulnerability of flesh. As we saw most recently in the naked legs of the runners in the marathon, who had ball bearings and nails piercing their flesh. There is exposure in the flesh. One is at most vulnerable as somebody who is on an April sunny day, exposed to the elements, running in carnival and joy, and suddenly it's at that very moment of exposure that one can be assailed, as they were, at their most vulnerable. But in that exposure to hostility, there is also in the skin a sensitivity. And Aristotle makes much of this in Book 2 of De Anima, the first book ever written in Western civilization about the senses. And he says that a sensitivity of touch is the most universal of all senses, because you cannot have any of the other five senses without touch. If you see, you're touched by photons. If you hear, you're touched by sound waves, and so on and so forth. Touch is the most universal, and it is in every part of your body, whereas smell is in your nose, and you got your ear, but touch is everywhere. So it's where you're most exposed to hostility that you are also the most ready for hospitality. That's why the handshake is so important. Indeed, in Ireland, we have a phrase about doctors, where you say, does he or she have a good bedside manner? A good bedside manner means not just a doctor comes along, takes your temperature and gives you your medical chart and then gives you a prescription, but somebody who sits down and takes your hand and listens to you before ever deciding what's wrong with you. And that's diagnostics. It's listening to the person, including their skin. And a good bedside manner is a good doctor. It's not just about, to quote Charles's phrase, reason and sight, but touch and taste. All right, let me leave Northern Ireland there and move to the Abrahamic tradition. Perhaps just one tiny little footnote before I come to the Abrahamic, and that is, since we were with Aristotle, just to say one word about touch, not in philosophy, but in Greek myth, and the famous moment of hospitality when, in one of the oldest stories ever written, along with the Bible, that is to say the Odyssey, Odysseus returns to his island. He comes back, and he is a stranger, hospes, zelos. He's a stranger. They don't recognize him. He's the beggar. But who does recognize him? He's recognized not by the suitors, not even by his wife Penelope originally. He's recognized by his nurse. And how did she recognize him? By touching his scar that he's had since a child, since he was a child. She touches the trauma in Greek, which means scar, wound. She knows his story. Nobody else does, but she knows it by touching him. And the second act of hospitality, after she recognizes him, is that he sits down, and his son Telemachus at that point eats with him in a swineherd's hut. And in that second act of eating, first of all, it's touching. The guest is received as a host, and there's a hospitality of recognition through touching by Euryclea, the nurse, maid, his nurse, his minder, childminder, and secondly, his son through eating. Before a word of recognition is spoken, before sight, there is a recognition through taste and through touch. So, moving on to the Abrahamic tradition, I want to say a word about each of the three, then perhaps a word about Hindu hospitality, time permitting, and then at the very end, perhaps say a few words about Guestbook and the practical initiative I'm involved in Northern Ireland and the Balkans and Jerusalem in trying to bring together enemies in these divided cities so that hostility may eventually convert, perhaps, into hospitality. So let's begin with the Hebraic tradition. We're going to hear from Sandy Coulthard and others tomorrow more about this, and in a more scholarly way than I could possibly address. But in atheism, I begin with the story of Abraham and Sarah, who receive the, in Genesis 18:14, the three strangers into their tent. And they come as strangers. In Latin, this is translated as hospites, advine, those who come from far away, and peregrinus, the wanderer. But they come as strangers, anishim in Hebrew. And Abraham looks at them, and Sarah looks at them, and who are these people? They've never met them before. They're coming from another tribe, another place, and they have a choice. Grab your sword and go out and chop their heads off. Fight. Or else bow down and offer them your best food and drink. He chooses the latter. They enter the tent, they receive the food, and they say, next year we are going to return, and Sarah, you will be with child. And she says, I can't be with child. Look at my husband, he's 350 years old. Look at me, I'm barren for the last 250. No way. And they say, yes, we will return in a year and you will have a child. And she laughs, because it is impossible. When something's impossible, you laugh, hysterically, or you cry. She laughed. And a year later they come back and a child is born. And the child is called Isaac, which in Hebrew is, probably means laughter. The impossible becomes possible through an act of converting hostility, the natural reaction, into hospitality. Interestingly, in the New Jerusalem Bible, we have a translation which follows the movement from three men who appear out of the desert, the strangers, to one stranger once they share the food. The idea being that God, as the one, emerges through the act of hospitality. God is born through the act of hospitality. God is in the stranger in the act of hospitality. And that is what makes the impossible possible. A child is born out of what otherwise would have been a killing. Natality replaces mortality. Psalm 119 tells us, I'm a stranger on this earth. God, the God of the Hebrews, is a stranger on this earth. The festival, the annual festival of Sukkot, is when, Sandy can tell you more about this than I could, the Jews reiterate the memory of being wanderers, wandering Arameans on this earth, as Abraham said, and they construct or replicate in some sense a tent or a cabin to remind themselves that they are always on, like the Messiah himself or herself, they are on the move. In Passover, which is also a passing over, a movement, there is the citation annually of the phrase, Exodus 22, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. So the Jews in the Passover identify with the strangers, not just themselves as strangers, but all people as strangers. And I know myself, living in Newton, Massachusetts, that we go to our neighbors every Passover and there is a sharing of food and a sharing of that citation and of the memory of the Passover, which of course is shared by the other Abrahamic religions also. I was struck when researching this opening chapter for Anatheism about how the earliest books of the Bible are all about strangers. Job, Ruth, the Song of Songs, Ruth, the Moabite alien accepted by Boaz into his community, thereby initiating a long line of hybrid descendants, including David, and, for Christians, very importantly, Jesus. While the last of these books, the Song of Songs, is paradigmatic of a coming together of Israel and the Egyptian enemy or adversary. King Solomon courts the foreign Shulamite woman, defying tradition to embrace this black and beautiful, as we're told in the opening verse, this black and beautiful stranger as his bride. And it's interesting that the song celebrates a Jewish love story about human divine love in the borrowed form of a Babylonian Egyptian marriage poem, or epithalamium. Loving your other is more divine than loving your own, which is arguably why the Hebrew Bible has 36 commands to love the stranger, many of them in Deuteronomy, and only 2 to love your enemy. Sorry, to love your neighbor. It's much easier to love your neighbor than to love the stranger. I will leave the Hebraic tradition, the Jewish tradition there for now, but would be very happy to come back to it, time permitting. Moving to the Christian tradition with no supersessionist intent, what you find in the inaugural act of Christianity is a stranger coming into a room and saying to a young Nazarene woman that she is going to have a child. Now, she doesn't laugh like Sarah laughed, but it's impossible that she is going to conceive a child. She is, as the phrase goes, a virgin, betrothed to Joseph, but a virgin. So the angel says, yes, you're right, because we're told she was troubled and pondered. Very interesting. She was troubled, direct, and pondered, dialogisimi, directi and dialogisimi. She dialogisimi with the angel. You know, what are you saying? She's debating between running, screaming, if you like, hostility, fright, flight, or hospitality. Yes, I will accept to conceive this child. And she's troubled. As all figures, same term used for whenever angels appear to humans with a divine message. They are troubled. Directi. Every angel is terrible, as Rilke, the German poet, puts it. She's troubled and ponders. And he says, but what is impossible to humans is possible to God. Udanaton for humans is dunaton for humans. And so she says yes. And her yes, her amen, is the equivalent to Sarah's laugh. It's saying, let the impossible become possible. So instead of the hostility that might have emerged from a stranger appearing to a very vulnerable and exposed and fragile young woman, in a gesture of divine love, she says yes, conceives the child, and the impossible child is born, meaning Emmanuel, it's called Emmanuel, and God is with him, El being the short for God. So Christianity then begins in that inaugural act of hospitality. She receives into her womb, Korah, the uncontainable, the impossible, the akorata. And you will find icons, even today in the temple of the Virgin in Constantinople, Istanbul, of this huge mosaic of Mary, the Madonna, and in her womb the child, and underneath Korah, akorata, the container of the uncontainable. And of course the womb is, the Korah, is shaped and figured and represented in the same shape as the chalice, which was the bowl of hospitality which Sarah and Abraham offered to the strangers. And when Andrei Rublev in 1600, the famous Russian Orthodox icon maker, was called upon to create the iconic representation of Orthodox Christianity, he represented the Trinity in terms not of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but that's what he was representing. It was in terms of the 3 angels. The 3 angels who were, of course, the 3 strangers who appeared to Abraham and Sarah. It's the same story, told, of course, in a very different idiom, different language, different time, different place. But it's the same story. The womb that receives the child is the bowl of food and wine that the strangers are invited to share with Abraham and Isaac. In both cases, out of that act of tasting comes the exchange of the human and the divine. Hostility becomes hospitality. Now, I'm not going to go through the Bible with you, sorry, the Christian Bible at this stage, but as you know, the first miracle of Jesus was what? Converting water into wine. Hospitality. His greatest miracle, it's arguable, but in my books, is the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Food, taste, hospitality. His last great act, while still a living mortal, was the Last Supper. The sharing of food and wine and the washing of feet. There is no ritual Eucharist without service to the other, the vulnerable, the alien, the stranger. Once resurrected, what does he do? He appears to the disciples and he says, as they come back from the lake where they've been fishing, and do not see him, and do not recognize him through sight or hear, he says, come and have breakfast. And it's in the smell of the mackerel, it's in the tasting of the food that they recognize Jesus. As a couple of minutes earlier or later, hard to keep up with Jesus once he's post-Paschal and kind of appearing all over the place, which is interesting, because he always appears as a stranger, and he's never recognized at first by sight. He walks on the road to Emmaus with the strangers, and they hear him, but they don't know what the hell he's saying, and they see him, but they do not recognize him until he breaks the bread. When he breaks the bread, they recognize him. The Christ figure returned as a stranger. And when he's asked, how will people enter the kingdom of heaven? Who will enter and who will not? He says, very simple. Those will enter who recognize that the divine is the stranger. Mark 25, repeated 5 times, hospes. I was a stranger who asked for what? Food. He didn't give it. Water. He didn't give it. If you gave to any stranger, you don't go up and say, are you a good Catholic? If you're a good Catholic, we'll give you charity. We'll give you, you got your food stamp. No questions asked. It's the stranger. It's the person you don't know. It's the person whose ID, whose baptismal cert, or whatever, remains utterly unknowable and unknown to you. That is the Messiah. And the Messiah will always be the stranger. So that multiplication in Christianity of the divine into all strangers who ask for food and water, and who also give food and water, because the host and the guest are interchangeable, and in many languages, hospes is host and guest. In French, hôte means host and guest. They're interchangeable. That's a radical, radical declaration of hospitality as the central virtue of Christian caritas, which is no different from the act of caritas extended towards the 3 strangers who turn out to be God by Abraham and Sarah. That's not to say there's no difference between Christianity and Judaism. There are huge differences. And if there weren't, you couldn't have interreligious dialogue, because a host is different from a guest precisely because one comes from somewhere else. So the Christian comes to Judaism as a stranger, and the Jew comes to the Christian as a stranger. And so it should be, to respect the differences. And there are differences, and there are things in Judaism that Christianity has forgotten in its rush for temporal power, in its rush for control, in its rush for quick and immediate representations and consolations. Whereas the Jew reminds the Christian, no, 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 the Messiah is always still to come. The Messiah is always the stranger. And Christianity may have things which may bring the Jew into conversation about aspects of Judaism that the Jew has forgotten. And ditto for Islam. So let me come to Islam. Very briefly, because time is ticking away, and I do want to give some time to the non-Abrahamic traditions also. In this little book, which I co-edited, Hosting the Strange Between Religions, there's a piece by a Muslim, Joseph Lombard, called Some Reflections on Hospitality in Islam. And he begins with this story. And as you can gather, I'm fond of stories, because I think interreligious hospitality works very often not by exchanging dogmas and doctrines and theories and theologies, but by exchanging stories. And here's a story that he tells about his first visit to a mosque in Morocco. One evening between the sunset and evening prayers, I was sitting in the courtyard of the famous Kurawaman Mosque in the old city of Fez in Morocco. I was scheduled to leave the country in just a few days and was enjoying this last opportunity to absorb the barakah, or blessing, that permeates this magical place. As I sat, an old man who was serving water to everyone in the courtyard came up to me and looked at me. Now, Joseph is an American. Muslim? He asked with a stern expression. I answered in the affirmative. Abuka Muslim? Is your father a Muslim? He asked. I replied, no. Umuku Muslim? Is your mother a Muslim? Again I replied, no. At this his face was transformed from that of the stern inquisitioner who had first approached me to a childlike joy. He began to cry, got down on his knees, hugged me and kissed me. Then with what appeared to be great difficulty, he got back up. To my horror, he grabbed a cup of water from the bucket he had been passing around, and with the expression of a young toddler presenting a gift to his or her parent, held this fetid water out to me and said, Bismillah, in the name of God. I knew I would get sick, but I also felt that I had to accept. And indeed, the generosity and hospitality of this old man was something that I quite literally carried home with me, unfortunately, in the form of giardia, whatever that is, but I can guess. He adds, nonetheless, this has always been one of my most cherished memories. For in his instant of joy, that man felt that he had to do something to offer hospitality to the stranger. With nothing on him and probably with few possessions other than the bare necessities, there was only one thing, a cup of water. Yet at the same time, I had learned something during my time in Morocco that I often forget elsewhere, namely that hospitality is a two-way street. Not only is extending hospitality toward family, friend, and stranger considered a moral imperative, so too accepting hospitality from others, however mean their circumstances may be, is a moral imperative. It is a way in which we manifest mercy towards one another, for each act of mercy in which we partake is a reflection of God's mercy. As a famous hadith or saying of the Prophet Muhammad that is known to all students of hadith states, I quote, the merciful human beings are shown mercy by the merciful God. Be merciful to those on earth, and he who is in heaven will be merciful unto you. Conversely, another hadith says, God is not merciful to one who is not merciful to people. In this sense, the kindness and mercy that human beings convey to one another can be seen as one of the ways in which God's mercy embraces all things and all people. The Prophet himself enjoins upon his followers, I quote from the Quran, what is faith? The Prophet replies to the question, what is faith? Iman. The Prophet replied, the giving of food and the exchange of greetings. Conversely, he is reported to have said, there is no good in one who is not hospitable. In all major Muslim feasts, such as the end of Ramadan and the feast of Hajj, as determined in the Quran 22:28, hospitality and providing for the poor is an absolutely core virtue. Let me now briefly, and before concluding, say a word about Hindu hospitality. In Hosting the Stranger, we go through 5 wisdom traditions. The Hebraic, the Christian, the Islamic, the Buddhist, and the Hindu. And I would like to do justice to all 5, but with time constraints, I'm afraid I cannot do so. But I would like to at least gesture towards, I see there may be something tomorrow on Buddhist hospitality. I would like to at least gesture towards Hindu hospitality. And in the example of one of the earliest Upanishads, the Taittiriya Upanishad, which is one of the oldest records of Indo-European civilization. And it basically begins, as does the Abrahamic tradition, with an act of food, of sharing food, of taste and touch, the handshake and the tasting of food and wine. And here in this ancient, one of the most ancient religious texts on record, we read how the divine manifests itself in the offering and eating of food. Again, I'm quoting you from Anathes. Treat your guests like gods, it says in the first book. Treat your guests like gods when giving food, for that food is Brahma. Anna is Brahma. Food is Brahma, the divine. The true self of mind and vital breath was considered to dwell within food in the Vedantin traditions, considered as an interconnection between the cosmic elements of air and earth. The task of the host was to discern this culinary correspondence between air and earth, and thereby recognize the God within the guest. Offering hospitality to the guest was considered a sacred act in that it reminds us of the integrity of body and soul, illustrated by the equation food equals true happiness equals Brahman. The Upanishad concludes with a resounding paean to the transfiguring power of food. The self becomes sacred in a sacramental identification with eating. I quote, I am food. I eat him who eats the food. I have conquered the whole universe. I am like the light in the firmament. Echoes perhaps of Eucharistics. The ancient belief, this ancient belief in Hinduism, ancient Vedantin tradition, found classic expression in the formula, Anna, food, is the manifestation of Brahman. And it later became the basis for a long Vedantin tradition of hospitality where saintly figures offer themselves as food and reveal themselves in the act of eating and being eaten. The unexpected guest, Atiti, who asks to be fed, is a god waiting to become manifest. In feeding the guest, we greet the divine and taste its food. So suffice it to note that the sacred sharing of food is not confined to Hindu or Abrahamic traditions, but is also found in other cultural myths of gods appearing as guests at the table of hospitality. And there's a section on Buddhism which recites various examples of that in that tradition. On studying such recurring motifs, as I tried to do in Hosting the Stranger in another book called Traversing the Imaginary, Journeys in Interreligious Imagination, which again looks into the five traditions. And then finally, in a more philosophical work called Phenomenology of the Stranger, Between Hostility and Hospitality. In studying the practices and theories and rites of hospitality in the five wisdom traditions, I came to the hypothesis that maybe there is some trans-cultural or trans-religious, quasi-universal practice of gustatory hospitality. It's something which interests me greatly. All such primal inaugural scenes of eating across these diverse religions and cultures bear witness to common practices of tasting the divine in the human and the human in the divine. They offer us choice ingredients for a gourmet guide to the gods, delicate degustation of hidden things. And in saying that, and in raising this hypothesis of a universal, or I prefer to say quasi-universal, but I don't want to get into syncretism and saying all religions are the same. They are not, decidedly not. And to say they are is actually to eliminate hospitality, because as I said earlier, if you don't have a guest who is a stranger, different from you, you cannot open your house. And in fact, you don't have a house to open up to them in any case, because there is no difference. You're in kind of an Hegelian universe where everybody is the same as everybody else. So in positing a quasi-universality to the inaugural rite, sacrament, act of sharing food, I'm not saying it's done the same in all the religions, or that it has the same valencies and so on. And I actually believe that one of the important virtues of interreligious hospitality is that by learning the different emphasis in the other religion, in the alien religion, the different religion, the stranger religion, you can discover aspects of the divine, aspects of the spiritual, that either have been forgotten in your own or have not yet been discovered in your own. And a real conversation, a real meeting of another mind, if it is to be hospitable, has to be open to the possibility that maybe in certain respects the other knows more than you. And you may have forgotten things that the other knows. Gandhi said it was when he read the Beatitudes that he went back to Hinduism, because he discovered that there were things in the Upanishads that he had forgotten and that maybe had been forgotten by many, which were the Beatitudes in Nuche, in German form. And he was able to go back to the Upanishads, back to his own Hindu tradition, and revive it and resurrect it in a politics of hospitality. Thomas Merton said that it was very often when he read Buddhist texts and Taoist texts and Hindu texts that he discovered many of the riches of Christianity, which he'd forgotten. Thich Nhat Hanh says very often to people who come to him and who want to convert to Buddhism, in some cases, he knows the hurt they're coming from. So he says, yes, come in, be a Buddhist. But very often he says to them, are you sure? Because maybe by studying with me and being with me and being with other Buddhists, you can become a better whatever it is you already are. A better Christian, a better Jew, a better Hindu. But precisely by going through the otherness of another religion, you may discover riches in your own that had been forgotten. There's a whole host of, in my own Catholic Christian tradition, there's a whole host of missionaries, many of them Benedictine, who went out to India. Merton obviously did it, in terms of the Trappists, as you know, died in Asia, tragically, but very much in conversation with Buddhism and Eastern religion. Abhishektananda, Henri Le Sceau, the French Benedictine, B. Griffiths, the English Benedictine, Sarah Grant, Scottish Benedictine, went out and in their interreligious Eucharists and in their interreligious dialogue with, in their cases, Hindus and Buddhists for the most part, they discovered aspects of Christianity that changed their own church, Vatican II. They were saying revolutionary things and were being silenced, along with Teilhard de Chardin, who went to China and so on. But they brought about precisely by their openness to other religions. And if there has been any kind of renewal in my own church, which has its fair share, if not a good majority of sins, as we know, the recent attempts to open up to Judaism, even John Paul II, he was a bit of a dictator, but he did some good things too. And his asking for forgiveness for what the Catholic tradition had done for millennia to Jews was a huge, huge gesture. And the opening to the Islamic tradition, to the Hindu tradition, has been something, I think, that shows that even in a church that has known so much war and violence, there has been, again and again, this attempt to convert hostility and persecution and intolerance and anti-Semitism into its opposite. So let me end with a word about, actually, before I go, I do want to end with a few five minutes, a few words about the Guestbook project. But before I do, I don't want to leave out the pagans. I kind of have a soft spot for the pagans. All those who are not in the great wisdom traditions. And Simone Weil, the great Jewish philosopher, believes it was very important for those of us, many of us here too, maybe too, in the Abrahamic tradition, not to be too censorious and intolerant about traditions that are not party to the Abrahamic. One thinks, for example, of Latin American native traditions, North American native traditions, the Aborigines, peoples who were really wiped out. And in our own Western tradition, we have a non-Abrahamic humanism that comes from the Greeks. And there's a wonderful story of hospitality, which I don't think we should forget. I've told the one about Odysseus, and maybe we can come back to that conversation, returning to Ithaca and being recognized as a stranger by his nurse. And let's not forget his dog, Argus. And how does he recognize him? He smells him. He sniffs him. So when I read Charles's note, I'm not entirely rejecting that third sense, which you talked about, which is the day of a parallel route is coming into view, one that travels through the senses of touch, smell, and taste. Argos, the canine flair, we must not forget how that too can bring us to a point of encounter with the other, where we decide wager between hostility and hospitality. But let me end with at least this more formal part before I finally get to 5 minutes on the practical. A story from classical Greek and Roman myth of Baucis and Philemon. Because Simon Weil said, we must recognize that it's not just in our Abrahamic traditions that the truth of love and hospitality have been revealed. We must believe that in other religions, if we are to be truly hospitable, well, not consider them all damned, the word, oh, we're the elect and they're the damned, and we're the good and they're the evil. We must recognize that in them there's already seeds and germs and prefigurations of the hospitality which we are hopefully bringing to them in dialogue. So there's a wonderful myth, originally Greek and then taken over by the Romans and told by Ovid, of Baucis and Philemon, who are an old couple in this town, and they're visited by two strangers who are Hermes and Zeus in disguise, but nobody will let them in to any house or inn or hostel in the town, except for Baucis and Philemon, who are aging and aged like Abraham and Sarah. And this poor couple, open the doors to them and invite them to receive food. So Baucis offers her best herbs, which she prepares, and then Philemon runs around this little dark room, cabin, looking for the precious goose, which of course was the sacred bird. And here's a passage from Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 8, which shows the central transformative role of food in this primal scene of carnal hospitality. I'm going to quote it at some length because there is such loving attention paid to each herb, each taste, each flavor, each savor. And if you think about it, where does sapientia, our word for wisdom, come from? Sapientia comes from sapere, savore, savourer, to taste. And here is the divine in the tasting, divine wisdom in tasting, sapientia in savourer, or savor. The old woman Baucis, her skirts tucked up, her hands trembling, placed a table there, but a table with one of the three legs unequal. Marvellous detail. A piece of broken pot made them equal. Pushed underneath, it counted the slope, and she wiped the level surface with fresh mint. You can almost smell it. On it she put the black and green olives that belong to pure Minerva, and the cornelian cherries of autumn, preserved in wine lees, radishes and endives, a lump of cheese, and lightly roasted eggs, untouched by the hot ashes, all in clay dishes. After this she set out a carved mixing bowl for wine, just as costly, with cups made of beechwood, hollowed out and lined with yellow beeswax. There was little delay before the fire provided its hot food, and the wine of no great age circulated, and then, removed again, made a little room for the second course. Oh, now there were nuts, and a mix of dried figs and wrinkled dates, and plums and sweet-smelling apples in open wicker baskets, and grapes gathered from the purple vines. And in the center was a gleaming honeycomb. Above all, there was the additional presence of well-meaning faces, Baucis and Philemon, and no unwillingness or poverty of spirit. The hosts are present. Meanwhile, the old couple noticed that as soon as the mixing bowl was empty, it refilled itself, unaided, and the wine appeared of its own accord. Think of the bowl, the Korah, of Mary. Think of the bowl of Abraham and Isaac. The more you take, the more it fills. They were fearful of this strange and astonishing sight, and timidly Baucis and Philemon murmured a prayer, their palms upward, and begged the gods' forgiveness for the meal in their their unpreparedness. They had a goose, the guard for their tiny cottage, and as hosts they prepared to sacrifice it for their divine guests. But quick-winged, it wore the old people out, and for a long time escaped them, at last appearing to take refuge with the gods themselves. Then the heaven-born ones told them not to kill it. We are gods, they said. Marvelous story. But think of the carnality, the materiality, the there-ness, the this-ness, the that-ness, the smell, the taste, the touch of the food. It's not just words. It's real food. And it's in the real food eaten that replenishes the food, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. The more you eat, the more you are given. The more you receive, the more you are given. Or in Buddhism, it's the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness, and emptiness in form. There is nothing fuller than the empty. The more you empty yourself, the more you will be filled by the divine. Christianity is called kenosis. Certain versions of Judaism, it's zimzu, the divine that withdraws and empties itself, uses space so that it can be filled again. So the cup that is consumed is the cup that refills endlessly and effortlessly, graciously, gratuitously. The impossible becomes possible. We are gods, say the strangers, and so they are. I just want to end then, that's it, but to end with a citation and then examples. A citation from Hebrews: do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some people have encountered angels unawares. And the examples are simply those which I'd now like to also discuss with you, anybody who's interested, of our hospitality initiative. Sheila Gallagher, myself, Sheila's my co-director, international co-director of Guestbook. And at the moment, we have been, you can look at the details if you wish on guestbookproject.com, but at the moment we're at a stage in this 5-year project of hospitality where we are working with young people in 3 divided cities, historically divided, ethnically, religiously, politically. Derry, Londonderry in Northern Ireland, where 90% of the schools still remain denominationally segregated. Mitrovica, where there is a river Ibar. In Derry it's a wall, the walls of Derry that separates the bauxite from the diamond. The Protestants inside, the Catholics outside of the bauxite. In Mitrovica it's a river Ibar that runs through it. On one side you've got the Serbian Christians, and on the other side the Muslim Bosnian Albanians. Different languages, different municipalities, different politics, different religion. Nobody crosses the river. And in Jerusalem you have the walls of Jerusalem, and you have the Palestinians and the Israelis, and you're all familiar with that obviously. So we're working in 2 words, and I'll stop them, with young people from both sides. The idea being that you've got to go to the young, to the new generation. All the stories I've told are about natality replacing mortality. You've got to begin with the young. The young are the possible, right? And have the passion for possibility and making the impossible possible, which is the miracle of hospitality coming from hostility. So in all these cities, they are living hostility. They're coming from generations of hostility. If they ask their grandparents what to do, they will say, defend yourself and kill the enemy. If they ask their parents what to do, they will say, defend yourself and stay away from the enemy. So what do you do? Well, can one expose one's arm? Can one chance one's arm? Can one taste food with the enemy? Those who have killed your fathers and forefathers and ancestors going generations back. That's the wager. So what we're doing in 2 words is we're inviting them to tell their stories. The siege of Derry, the walls of Derry, going back to the 16th century, 17th century in Derry. The Battle of Kosovo, again going back to the late Middle Ages for Mitrovica, the Balkans. And then of course the story we're telling in the case of, I shouldn't say of course, it's a choice that we've made with the students, is that of Abraham. Because for the Muslims, Ishmael is the favorite son. For Jews, Isaac in the Mount Moriah scene is the favorite son. So the question is, they tell their different stories, right? We have a Jewish student called Yahim and a Palestinian called Riham. Literally means mercy, womb, Korah. It's an interesting name. Charity. And they tell a story. Riham says, well, you know, in the Hadith and so on, Ishmael is the son. And Yahim, who's an Hasidic Jew, says, in our story, in our narrative, the other brother, Isaac, is the favorite, beloved son. So they tell their story, and then the challenge for them, as for those in Mitrovica and Northern Ireland, telling different stories which have historically divided their political, cultural, religious imaginations for centuries. In the case, and I'll just isolate the case of Jerusalem, they then, in part 2, exchange stories. So the Jew tells the story of the Muslim, and the Muslim tells the story of the Jew. And then in a third part, they co-create, in good kind of rabbinical hermeneutic fashion, a third story, where Ishmael and Isaac are no longer hostile brothers and rivals for the privileged inheritance, the primogeniture, if you will, but they are sharers of hospitality. Now it's up to the students too, and they're doing it as we speak, invent in and through a hospitable imagination stories or a story where they can cross memories and somehow reinvent the possible, which of course is what Messianic means, Messianic promise means, from the beginning of the Abrahamic tradition to the end of the Abrahamic tradition. So on that note, I will end, and if you have, as I hope you will, questions and comments, we can have conversation. Thank you for your attention.
Questions? Paul.
I'm wondering, when you ask somebody to tell the youth to tell their story, do they speak personally, or do they speak of the story in their religious tradition? And I'm wondering how far back they go to share their story. In other words, are they carrying much of the hostility of the past, or have they somehow severed themselves a bit from that in their retelling?
It's a great question, and of course it varies. It varies because there are different pairings, and they react in different ways. But what's very important is that they must carry some of the hostility, otherwise the wager of hospitality doesn't really matter. I mean, supposing you were to get a secular, non-believing Jew and a secular, non-believing Palestinian and ask them to have a meal, sure, they'll have political differences, but they won't be telling the story of where they come from in terms of their religious culture. So what interests us in terms of interreligious dialogue is obviously, in that instance, a Jew and a Palestinian who do carry with them their tradition. But not just the negative hostility, also the promise of hospitality and the stories of hospitality, right? So they are aware, in both cases they're practicing believers. And do they bring something personally? Absolutely, in two senses. They bring their own personal experience. For example, Yahim is going into military service. So for the next 2 or 3 years, he will not be able to have any exchange. It's not permitted with the enemy, right? And at the moment, there is still an embargo in the Palestinian community that there is no contact, educational or cultural, with those inside the walls, I mean, with Israel, if you're outside, if you're Palestinian. So it's forbidden for both. So they come with that story of how they're not allowed cross, and they come with stories of great pain, of how they feel besieged and put upon and maimed by their enemy. So they carry all that baggage, and if they don't, it's not really a wager. It's not really a task or a challenge. And then the big challenge is, in spite of that, and carrying all that, is there something in one's Abrahamic tradition, the two Abrahamic traditions, with all the richness that I've been trying to cite here, and that they're aware of, to then using their imaginations, their creative imaginations, and working with artistic media, right? And then, of course, they work with websites and they post their video on the guestbook website, and then it kind of goes viral, and other people students from other divided communities can join in, right? So they realize they're not the only ones. There are Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, and there are Albanians and Serbs in Mitrovica who are going through similar conversions from hostility to hospitality. And that's where, to come back to the title, the global interreligious aspect comes in. And that's one of the beauties of the virtual world, of the World Wide Web. You know, for all its faults, this virtual proximity of people over distance can actually allow for a communication, even sometimes in anonymity. They have to use pseudonyms because if they were found out, they could be shot. Right? Not in Northern Ireland, but in Mitrovica, yes. And maybe even some of the Palestinians, you know, oh, my neighbor is communicating this way. So there is, to come back to the final, there is the personal leap of faith into the impossible through an act of imagination, and I would say compassion and caritas, because that's what hospitality is. And we're still at a very, initial stage with this. It may fail, but if it does succeed, it's going to be with the younger generation. I'm convinced. And I think the contemporary technology, media technology that we have, for all its faults, can also provide a huge facility in communicating across boundaries and barriers, which cannot be physically traversed, but can be virtually traversed. Yes, I think you had a question.
Have you deployed this wonderful guestbook project strategy in the States? And if so, it strikes me that in the cities that you mentioned, it's pretty obvious where the source of hostility is, and that here, across this religious divide, it's a little more subtly.
Yeah.
So do you actually have to dredge up the hostility to use this? Or what do you do to use it here?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and we're trying to. For example, one of our co-directors, Fanny Howe, professor in Georgetown, made a video with her black and white students, because there's huge class divisions in Georgetown. It's a very privileged Catholic university, and then outside it, slumlands. Traditionally, there was a big divide. So that's one example of racial difference and hostility, and the students then kind of exchange their stories. And then another, carried out by a BC student from California, is in Los Angeles, the immigrant communities, Mexican, Hispanic communities, who are telling their story of crossing the border, and some of them, absolutely appallingly tragic stories of relatives dying and so on. It just doesn't bear repeating. And then the white community, who are policing it, some of them pretty racist, and others more tolerant. It's funny, there's two brothers, one who's policing the border and believes in keeping them out, and then another brother who's actually working in this hospitality initiative to put out water in the desert where immigrants coming across and refugees can actually get water so that they don't die literally crossing the border. So that's another example, within the United States, but I think you can do it in any city. I mean, we do it with our students in Boston College, but there the divisions are not that difficult to bridge because, they're privileged students and they're graduate students or undergraduate students. So it's easier to do it there. For example, one thing we did last year was two of Sheila's students, one Japanese and the other Korean. And as you may know, it's in the news again these days, the Dokko Islands are disputed for centuries between Korea and Japan. Korea was appallingly treated not just by the Chinese, but by the Japanese, particularly in the Second World War. So there's a huge hostility there, huge. And the camera goes, you can see it actually, it's a beautiful little piece. They put together, these two young students, a Japanese girl and a Korean boy called Peter Chung, I think. And he tells the story, so, oh no, Dokko belongs to the Koreans, and we have documents that go back to the 14th century, and it shows, we were fishing and we have it there, and it belongs to us, and it's in our chart. And then the Japanese girl says, well, it has been proven, that we have this, and she cites all, the political treaties and claims. And then that's the end of it. You go camera to camera to camera to camera, the two sides, and you see the Dotko Islands with all these birds flying around. They're uninhabited now. Beautiful islands, but sort of midway between Japan and Korea. And then the second half, and they just came up with this themselves, they invented, now they're pretty creative students, and of course they work with Sheila, who's Professor of Fine Arts and Art, and they produced this video to a Lady Gaga song, great song actually, where they do this dance in kind of, what's it, mime? How would you describe the
anime dance.
Right, but what's the actual technical term for the kind of technique they use to produce the two characters? Kind of animated?
Yeah, anime or manga.
Okay, okay, that's the technical term. And they start by fighting each other, right? And he kicks her, and blood comes out of her. You know, she starts crying, and the tears turn into blood, and she kind of goes like this, and then she hits him, and it's kind of done in the form of a computer game, a simulated computer game, and then it turns into a dance, and they end up embracing. And it's very powerful. But that's just a way in images, in a narrative image of turning hostility to hospitality, by them working just with animated, you know, techniques through video. So that's an example that happened in BC. But they're all tiny examples. And these are young students. I mean, we're talking about Clay, who did the one on the Mexican border. I think he's 19. Your kids are maybe the same, 19 or 20. But it's amazing what they can do with a computer. They don't need film crews and stuff. They can go with their iPhone and a computer, and then what is it called? Edit Pro? And they got a movie, you know? They can do it. We can't, but they can. And they can be, the facility, you know, Joseph Beuys, the great German artist, said, we're now in an age where everybody can be an artist. Now that's a facile statement at one level, but at another level, the capacities are there technologically, the means are there for people, particularly if they're taught by Sheila Gallagher and people like her, to be very creative using the available, very accessible, very financially feasible media. So you can start anywhere, basically. You can start here, and you know, students will do it too, I'm sure. Yes? You know, the man with the white hair, the good-looking man with the white hair.
Me?
Yeah.
I have to say, you know, before the hospitality with Abraham, there is the element of humility. And then come the touch.
Yeah.
Abraham washes their feet.
Mm.
He oiled their feet also.
Correct.
He showed that he's sincere.
Mm.
Through the sincerity comes the hospitality.
Yeah.
You know, it's not only the lip service.
Oh, no.
It's from all the heart.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to say, and haven't said as eloquently or as succinctly as you have put it in a sentence. But yes, the washing of the stranger's feet under the mamre tree, or the sharing of food, likewise the Last Supper, he washes their feet, and the oiling of the feet. It's in touch and taste before ever words are spoken. So I'm in total agreement with you, yes. Yes?
You know, I'm almost compelled to respond to the comment you made between Isaac and Ishmael as hostility. The only hostility are from the adherents of religion. Because if you read the Old Testament, leaving alone who was sacrificed and who wasn't.
Sure.
If you read the Old Testament, they buried their father. They lived together, and there was intermarriage between the two tribes,
Sure.
which denotes to me some sort of hospitality,
Sure.
not hostility. And if you read the Quran, Isaac and Ishmael and Abraham laid the cornerstone of the Kaaba, which is a centerpiece for the Islamic faith in which we celebrate Abraham. So I just question the hostility, because I think the hospitality shows more.
Yeah.
You just have to read it the right way.
Sure. No, absolutely. And it all comes down to hermeneutics. In the beginning was the word, and in the end was the word in terms of interpreting the word. You're absolutely right. But what I'm saying is that we also live with a history, de facto, alas, of religious wars between these two religions and the Christian religion, you know, the three of them, the warring children. That's not the fault of Ishmael and Isaac. It's the fault of how it was interpreted. We are the privileged ones, you are the infidels. And it came from all three religions directed at the other. And they would reread the story, and, you know, some would say, look, Ishmael was thrown out with Hagar. They were left to die. You know, this was not a good act. He was the rejected son. And as you know, well documented now, American white racism invoked again and again the story of Isaac and Ishmael to say the blacks, the Muslims, those with dark skin are the descendants of Ishmael. It was used again and again in racist tracts. So I'm talking about hostility. I'm not blaming revealed scripture for this. I'm blaming the interpretations of it. The political, colonial, racist, imperialist interpretations stroke misinterpretations. So an exchange of stories is precisely an opportunity to come back to the very point you were making, which is that in the text there is already hospitality, but it has all too often been overlooked in terms of who is the favorite son. So thank you for that corrective, it's very important. Yes, I think you and you. Yeah.
I have a question and a comment. I'm interested in the whole idea of touch and of course the food aspect, but how is that, does that play out in Islam and maybe in Buddhism and Hinduism as well? The comment is in Judaism, I'm a rabbi, so I can speak on that. We have the tradition of, from the sacrificial times, that you have to finish eating the sacrifice within 3 days, the most. And if it was a huge sacrifice, then you had to obviously share it with the other people. So that, and then food from that became a part of the worship. So that's why we have all these Jewish meals like the Seder and such.
You know, the restaurants also.
I learn from what you say, and in relation to Buddhism and Islam, it would really be better for Buddhists and Muslims to speak authoritatively on that. I mean, I've edited books about it, but the experts, there are experts here who come from those traditions and could speak about it. The sharing of food, as the articles in Hosting the Stranger written by Buddhist lamas argue and indicate, is central to that tradition. And in Islam, there are Muslims here who know exactly the degree to which the Prophet's invitation, if not injunction, to share food and feed the poor during the Hajj and Ramadan, the end of Ramadan, are practiced by Muslims. And I know myself when I went to Algeria and Morocco for the first time, I could not get over the fact that when I arrived off the boat, the first thing was I was welcomed into these young people came up and invited me and my friend into their house and gave me, they were really poor people. First thing, I couldn't believe it. Coming from Europe, crossing, the Straits of Gibraltar, there am I, arrived in this country, and for them it was a sacred rite of hospitality. It was just, and everywhere I went in Morocco, that's what I experienced. But you would have to talk to Islamic scholars to kind of go through the chapter and verse probably in Quran and then see how it works out in rites. But as I say, in Ramadan and the Hajj, apparently it's a sacred virtue, feeding the poor and sharing food. Yes, Richard. Oh, and then yes, sorry, you had a question there. Okay, after Richard, and then. Yes. Do you want to go first? Then I think you were next. Yes, oh, okay. And then Richard.
A moment of context for the question. When some of us met for dinner beforehand, Padma and I joked about how it's the same old faces all the time at this type of event, which is not by itself a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it leads to the question of what, in your experience, has been the ways to overcome the fear and the apathy that people have that prevent them from engaging in hospitality. And fear sometimes is fear of loss of righteousness or fear of loss of power, prestige, or position of some source of loss of wealth, whatever it may be. There's usually some form of fear, or the other end, it's just apathy. They just couldn't care less. What has been your experience in dealing with
I think we live in a culture of fear. And you could take any culture, we could start with America, we could go to Ireland, you know, start from where you are. And it's not easy to see that fear is probably the dominant cultural emotion. So that doesn't mean that people aren't loving and being kind and being generous, but to bring it out into a radically transforming ethos of hospitality is really difficult. So I think recognizing that hostility and fear are almost the basic ingredient, although not fully acknowledged. I mean, just look at gun control. I mean, why do people all need to carry a gun around, you know? I mean, it was so important during lockdown in Boston that second suspect was not shot, that it was the police that were sent in, not the army. You know, there was minimal violence showed. It was extraordinary. And the majority of people in Boston, it's not a, you know, a trigger-happy place. It has lots of faults. But it's not a place where people carry guns, for the most part. And I think the response to that incredibly hostile act of aggression was in fact very, if I can put it this way, courageous, in that there was huge solidarity and a huge sense of not patrolling vigilantes the street to catch this guy, but letting those who could do so, clearing the space so nobody would get hurt, and taking that person alive was essential for two reasons. To find out why they did it. Why they did it. As Spinoza, the great, you know, Jewish philosopher, put it, when terror strikes, do not fear, do not complain, try to understand. And it's so important to try to understand the story that brought about that act of terror. If we don't, it'll just happen again, because the reflex is fear. And the answer to fear is violence. Get more guns. I mean, that's what the National Rifle Association said. Arm everybody. And then these guys can't get away with it. Arm kids going into school. Give 2-year-olds, teach them how to shoot. Right? That's cultural fear. So, I think in that respect it was kind of exceptional. But as we know, a majority in the House of Congress have voted against these basic forms, even minimal forms of gun control. That's a culture of fear. So, beginning with acknowledging the way things are. I mean, this mandatory cheer, we've all got to have kind of, you know, bright toothpaste smiles, everything's happy, is not the way to go forward. One has to acknowledge the fear at the heart of the culture and the divisions, in spite of all the rhetoric, and then hospitality can take place. But I think the second thing is to work with young people. Right? And, I mean, that might be a next step. I don't know whether there's anybody under the age of 60 in this room, but and it's lovely to be amongst, you know, fellow wise, seasoned, aging people. But Kevin, I know you're a teenager. But that might be a next step, you know, to go to the next generation who are hungry, who are absolutely hungry for this kind of thing. But I mean, it has to start somewhere, and this is your great people, and Charles and Richard and John, Olaf, who I've met, and others. Yeah, Richard, you had a question at the back.
Yes, I do. Much of the description we've had tonight about the hostilities had to do with kind of sectarian or inter-religious differences. And to go back to the possibility of working with younger people, and as you were describing the guest book project and having the young people go through a process of invention of another narrative, another story with other motifs and other possibilities arising from...
And reinvention also, because we're going back and reinvent, yeah.
Yes. I'll stick with invention.
Okay.
Because the reinvention,
okay.
But it's an interesting point you make. What I want to bring up is the hostility, the potential for hostility, intergenerational hostility, as those within faith communities face the invention of the youth that challenges their canonical beliefs or their traditions, and places the established members of the community, of the faith community, in some stress.
Yeah. And fear. Yeah.
Yeah, some fear of perhaps losing the perpetuation of the tradition and beliefs that are dear to them, but finding the youth inventing, not reinventing their faith community, but inventing a new one that no longer necessarily aligns with that which preceded.
No, I think that's absolutely at the core of the problem and the core of the solution. But I'm getting little signs, hospitable signs here from my host that time is tight, and maybe tomorrow, I know there are various talks and workshops, and I look forward to then listening to you and learning from you, and I think you're giving a talk tomorrow, Richard, so I'll be asking you the answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to make sure that Richard has 15 minutes at the coffee table for informal meeting and dialogue, and in addition to what you've just heard.